I need a boyfriend by tomorrow, Elena Hartley whispered into her phone, ducking behind the espresso machine as steam hissed against the window glass. No, Sophie, you don't understand. Camille's wedding is tomorrow. Aunt Priscilla thinks I've been seeing someone for months. At the corner table, the man with the silver-white hair did not lift his eyes from the tablet in front of him, though he had stopped reading 3 sentences ago. He had been coming to the Wren and Thistle for the better part of a season, always at the same hour, always ordering the same dark, bitter coffee that no one else in Wintermere seemed to want. His skin held the pallor of moonlight on stone, unnatural in a city that rarely saw the sun, and his stillness was the kind that made careful people uneasy without knowing why. Elena had served him a dozen times. She knew nothing about him except that his hands were always cold when their fingers brushed over the counter, and that he never seemed to blink at the right moments. The guy who promised to help canceled, she hissed into the phone, unaware of how far her voice carried in the emptying café. Business trip. Convenient, right? She listened, then groaned, pressing her forehead to the cool tile wall. I cannot show up alone. Aunt Priscilla will spend the whole reception asking why I'm still single, why I don't own a house, and whether there's something wrong with me. The man closed his tablet with a soft, deliberate click. For longer than Elena could have guessed, no one had surprised him. He had watched centuries fold into one another the way pages turn in a book already read, and he had grown so practiced at anticipating human desire that very little still caught his attention. People wanted his money, his influence, his name attached to their causes. Nobody had ever, entirely by accident, handed him a problem this absurd, this human, this impossible to purchase. When Elena ended the call, she returned to the counter with a professional smile that did nothing to hide the panic beneath it. He watched her a moment longer, then rose and crossed the room, moving with a silence that made the floor seem to swallow his footsteps. Another coffee? She asked, not quite looking at him. No, he said. I have a proposal. Her expression sharpened into caution. You overheard that. I did, I apologize, but you need a boyfriend by tomorrow. Embarrassment curdled into irritation. Sir, this isn't funny. I'm not joking. He extended his hand. Adrian Ashcombe. Milo leaned over the counter, unable to help himself. Just to clarify, he said, you're asking a customer to pretend to date my coworker after listening to her entire meltdown through the espresso machine. That is an accurate summary, Adrian said, without a trace of embarrassment. And you're doing this because it is the most interesting request anyone has made of me in longer than you would believe. Milo looked at Elena, eyebrows raised in silent, exaggerated warning, and Elena shrugged back at him, still too rattled to trust her own judgment. He does own a very nice car, Milo offered helpfully, peering through the window at the sedan idling at the curb. That is not a character reference, Milo. It's something. Elena turned back to Adrian, studying his composed, unreadable face for some crack in the performance, some sign that this was an elaborate joke at her expense. She found none. If this is a prank, she said slowly, it is an extraordinarily elaborate one. I promise you it is not, and if I say no, then I finish my coffee and go back to being bored, and you go back to inventing an excuse for tomorrow. No consequences either way. The lack of pressure in his voice, more than anything else he had said, was what finally tipped the decision in his favor. Every dishonest offer she had ever received in her life had come wrapped in urgency, and his did not. She stared at his hand before shaking it, and the cold of his skin startled her, though she said nothing. Elena Hartley, I'm available tomorrow. I'm tall. I own several suits. I can behave appropriately at formal events, and I am, by long practice, extremely skilled at pretending to enjoy conversations I find tedious. Elena blinked at him. You're offering to pretend to be my boyfriend, your serious boyfriend, possibly your future fiancé, depending on how dangerous your aunt turns out to be. Behind the espresso machine, her coworker Milo suddenly developed an intense interest in polishing a single cup. Elena folded her arms. Why would you do this? Because my life has become unbearably predictable, and yours for one afternoon was not. That might be the worst reason I've ever heard. It is also the truth. She studied him the way a person studies a locked door, trying to guess what waited on the other side. He looked expensive, unnervingly calm, and faintly, thrillingly dangerous, though she could not have said why the word came to mind. You could be a serial killer, she said. So could your aunt, he replied, and something in his tone, dry and unhurried, startled a laugh out of her despite everything. I would compensate you, he added, for the inconvenience of the weekend. She stiffened immediately. I'm not selling anything. Neither am I. You would be losing a day of wages and spending your Saturday in a ridiculous arrangement that benefits us both. I would pay the equivalent of several months of what this cafe pays you. Her expression changed, and he recognized it at once. Having spent 3 centuries learning to read the difference between greed and simple relief, her eyes did not brighten with want. They softened with calculation. My younger brother needs a tutor, she said quietly, almost to herself. He's falling behind in school, and I can't afford the kind of help he needs. Then use the money for him. She looked at him for a long moment, the steam from the espresso machine curling between them like something alive. One condition, she finally said. I need to understand the man I'm supposedly dating. Adrian smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had just been asked, for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, for something other than access. Fair, he said. Your shift ends soon? It ends in 11 minutes. Too late. We have less than a day to manufacture a believable relationship. She pulled off her apron so fast the strings tangled. Milo stared at them, wide-eyed, and Elena pointed a warning finger at him. You heard nothing. Absolutely nothing, Milo said solemnly, still polishing the same cup, except possibly the beginning of the strangest story I will ever get to tell. Outside, the rain over Wintermere had thinned to a fine silver mist, and a black car waited at the curb with an engine that made no sound at all. Elena stopped on the sidewalk. You drive that? I told you I was dependable. That's not what dependable looks like. That's what untouchable looks like. Then tomorrow, Adrian said, opening the door for her, we will make certain your aunt only notices the dependable part. For the first time since the disastrous phone call, Elena laughed freely, the sound rising into the wet evening air. And for the first time in longer than he wished to count, Adrian Ashcombe forgot entirely to check whether anyone was watching him. It should have troubled him more than it did. In his world, being watched was not a possibility but a certainty, and getting to notice was the kind of carelessness that had, in ages past, cost careless kings their crowns. But as Elena slid into the seat beside him, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and already muttering under her breath about what on earth she had just agreed to, Adrian found that he did not particularly care. Somewhere above the city, unseen in the low clouds, a single raven wheeled once and was gone, and if Adrian noticed it through the tinted window, he said nothing about it at all. For the first several minutes of the drive, Elena said nothing at all, watching the wet streets of Wintermere slide past the window while some quieter, more sensible part of her tried to talk her out of the entire arrangement. A stranger, however well-dressed, however oddly gentle his voice had sounded when he said her problem mattered to somebody, was still a stranger, and she had just agreed to spend the next full day building a fictional life around him. You're quiet, Adrian observed, not taking his eyes from the road. I'm doing the math on how insane this is. And what does the math say? That I should probably call Sophie and ask her to check on me tomorrow in case you turn out to be something worse than eccentric. A reasonable precaution, he said, entirely without offense, which somehow reassured her more than any protest could have. She did call Sophie from the car, murmuring the barest outline of the plan while Adrian pretended, with visible effort, not to listen. Sophie's response arrived as a long disbelieving pause followed by a single instruction, delivered half laughing and half serious. Send me a photograph of him before tomorrow, and text me the moment anything feels wrong. Elena promised she would, and when she lowered the phone, she found Adrian watching her with something that might have been approval. Your friend sounds sensible, he said. She usually is. Good. I would rather you trust someone enough to check on you than trust me blindly because I own a nice car. It was such an unexpectedly reasonable thing to say that Elena laughed despite the tightness still sitting in her chest, and by the time they reached the first red light downtown, the sensible part of her had quieted enough to let her lean back into the seat and simply watch the city blur by, cautiously, tentatively, willing to see where the next day led. Their emergency planning session began before they had left downtown Wintermere behind. How did we meet? Adrian asked, merging into traffic with the ease of a man who had never once needed to check a mirror. At a charity dinner, Elena said. Which charity? I never invented that part. Dangerous, he said, and she turned to glare at him. You're taking this disturbingly seriously. If we lie badly, we fail. I would rather not fail. We're not invading a country. Your aunt sounds considerably more difficult to negotiate with. Elena laughed despite herself, and over the next half hour, they built their story together, piece by careful piece. They had met through mutual friends at a fundraiser supporting a youth education program, the kind of soft, admirable detail that would survive scrutiny. Adrian would be a private investor who specialized in restoring failing companies, which was, in its own strange way, close enough to the truth to hold. His age would remain what it always appeared to be, though the number he gave, 34, was a fraction of the years actually behind his pale eyes. They had supposedly been together for 2 months, their relationship intense but sensible, the wording Elena insisted her aunt would appreciate. Adrian entered every detail into his phone, with the precision of a man closing a merger, and Elena watched him with something between amusement and disbelief. "You're taking notes. I don't lose negotiations because someone forgot a detail. My aunt is not a negotiation. That remains, as far as I can tell, entirely unproven." Their next stop was a quiet shopping street where old brick buildings leaned companionably toward one another over the wet cobblestones. Elena looked through the window of an elegant boutique and immediately shook her head. "I own a dress. What kind?" "Black. Bought on sale 2 years ago." Adrian's expression grew faintly troubled, as though she had confessed to a crime. "A man who has supposedly built a life around you does not bring you to a summer vineyard wedding dressed for a funeral audit." "My dress is fine. This is operational credibility." "Normal people call this shopping, Adrian." Inside, Elena protested nearly every price tag she saw, and Adrian ignored every protest with the calm of a man for whom numbers had long ago stopped meaning anything at all. He asked the associate for something elegant, nothing theatrical, and when Elena finally emerged from the fitting room in a long dress the color of dusk over water, Adrian stopped speaking entirely. For the first time since proposing this ridiculous scheme, the amused calculation left his face, replaced by something quieter and far less practiced. Elena noticed. "Well?" she asked, and he recovered a beat too late. "Excellent," he said, and the word came out strangely human, stripped of its usual polish. "Don't get used to that reaction," she said, though her cheeks had gone warm. "We still need shoes." Between the boutique and the shoe shop, they stopped for coffee at a small stand tucked beneath an awning, and Elena watched with growing fascination as an older man in a fine coat crossed the entire width of the plaza simply to greet Adrian, addressing him with a deference that seemed strangely disproportionate for a passing acquaintance. "Mr. Ashcombe," the man said, inclining his head slightly lower than a simple nod required. "A pleasure, as always." "Corwin," Adrian replied, and though his tone stayed light, Elena noticed the way the man's eyes did not quite meet Adrian's directly, the way his hands stayed carefully folded rather than offered for a handshake. When he had gone, Elena raised an eyebrow. "Employee of yours, a business associate." "He bowed at you. He did not bow. He absolutely bowed, Adrian." Adrian's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Some people simply have excellent posture," he said, and though Elena let the subject drop, she found herself replaying the strange little scene for the rest of the afternoon, filing it away beside the ice of his hands and the unhurried, watchful stillness that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Later, while they waited for the shoe shop to find her size, Elena asked him, almost idly, whether he had always lived in Wintermere. "Not always," Adrian said. "I have lived in a great many places. Which was your favorite?" He considered the question with more weight than it seemed to deserve. "I have not decided yet," he said finally, and something about the careful, unhurried honesty of the answer made her wonder, not for the first time that day, exactly how long a life he was measuring his favorites against. By evening, they reached her apartment, a modest set of rooms above a bakery near the edge of the old dish, where the smell of bread still lingered in the stairwell long after closing. Adrian removed his coat and sat at her small kitchen table while she made tea, and the sight of him there, too composed, too still, too obviously expensive in a kitchen with a crack running down one tile, made her laugh out loud. "What? You look like someone dropped a boardroom into my kitchen by accident." He opened his tablet again. "We need personal information. Favorite food, grilled cheese." He looked faintly disappointed. "What? I was hoping for something more useful." "It is useful. You love grilled cheese too now." "I do? You do now." They continued through favorite films, childhood memories, small annoying habits, the shape of an argument they might plausibly have had. Elena decided Adrian always arrived early. Adrian decided Elena left coffee cups scattered through every room she occupied, which was, he noted with some satisfaction, already true. Their invented disagreement involved furniture for a house they were supposedly considering somewhere outside the city, a detail that would later cause Elena more trouble than she anticipated. Then Adrian asked, without looking up from the screen, "Why do I love you?" Elena nearly dropped her mug. "We don't need that one, your aunt will ask." She considered it, tea steam curling between them. "Say I make your life less serious." Something shifted behind his pale eyes. "That may be too believable." "Why do you love me then?" she pressed, testing him. "I don't," he said. "This is a performance." Again, Credibility. She studied him a long moment. Because you pay attention, she said finally. You noticed I needed help. You noticed my brother matters to me. You noticed I was embarrassed instead of laughing at me. That is dangerously sincere for a lie. Then your aunt will believe every word of it. They practiced small gestures after that. The way a hand might rest at the small of a back, the correct distance to stand without looking uncomfortable, the exact pressure of fingers laced together in public. No kissing, Elena said immediately, before he could offer. Agreed, Adrian said. Not even for dramatic effect. I manage a great deal of money, Elena. I am fully capable of respecting a contractual boundary. You proposed pretending to be a stranger's boyfriend within 5 minutes of overhearing her phone call. Unusual circumstances call for unusual flexibility. As midnight crept closer, Elena glanced toward her narrow sofa, calculating whether it could reasonably fit a grown man. You're not sleeping there. I assumed not. He made a single phone call, low and unhurried, and less than an hour later a car arrived downstairs bearing a folded cot and fresh linens, delivered by a driver who never once met Elena's eyes and vanished before she could thank him. She stared at the neatly stacked bedding. You own an emergency bed? My staff can locate almost anything within the hour. That's terrifying. It's efficient, Adrian said, and something in the practiced ease of the answer made her wonder, not for the first time that day, exactly how large the world he came from truly was. Before retreating to her bedroom, Elena paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame. Adrian, yes, why are you really doing this? He looked around her small apartment, at the stack of unpaid bills tucked beneath a magnet on the refrigerator, at the second-hand furniture arranged with obvious care, at her brother's handwritten school schedule pinned crookedly to the wall. When he answered, his voice had lost its polish entirely. I think I have spent too many years solving expensive problems, he said. And mine? Yours matters to somebody. She held his gaze a moment longer than either of them expected, then nodded and closed her door softly behind her. Long after the apartment fell quiet, Adrian remained exactly where he sat, motionless in the way only something that did not need to breathe could be motionless. For centuries he had measured his days in treaties, tributes, and the slow accumulation of power that came to those who outlived everyone foolish enough to oppose them. Yet the thought occupying him now was smaller and stranger than any of that. Whether he had remembered correctly that Elena hated olives and loved old mystery films and always slept with one lamp burning against the dark, it was a ridiculous thing to dwell on, and somehow, absurdly, it felt important. He did not sleep that night, though sleep, in the human sense, had not troubled him in longer than most nations had existed. Instead, he sat with the small cot folded and untouched beside him, listening to the city breathe outside the window, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, to wonder what it might feel like to want something he could not simply acquire. His kind did not often speak of loneliness. It was considered a weakness unworthy of a ruler, a wound better hidden than tended. But sitting in the borrowed quiet of a stranger's kitchen, surrounded by mismatched mugs and a child's spelling homework held up by a magnet shaped like a strawberry, Adrian Ashcombe, who had once been called king by courts older than the mountains that ringed Wintermere, found himself unwilling to name the feeling pressing against his chest, for fear that naming it would make it real. Elena woke sometime past 3 in the morning to the particular silence of a house holding its breath, and when she padded barefoot into the front room for a glass of water, she found Adrian standing at the window rather than resting on the untouched cot, so utterly still that for one disorienting moment she mistook him for a shadow cast by the street lamp outside. You're supposed to be asleep, she whispered, startled. I told you, I don't sleep much. You don't move much either, apparently. He turned toward her then, unhurried, and the moonlight through the thin curtain caught the pale angles of his face in a way that struck her for the first time as genuinely strange rather than simply striking. Does it frighten you? He asked, watching her carefully. A little, she admitted, because some instinct told her lying to him would accomplish nothing. But not enough to make me go back to bed without asking why you're standing in my living room like a statue at 4 in the morning. I like watching the city when it thinks no one is paying attention, he said. It behaves more honestly. She considered that, wrapped in the oversized sweater she slept in, and found she understood the sentiment more than she expected to. Is that why you come to the café every day? Because it's honest? Partly, Adrian said. Partly because you always give me the good table without being asked. Elena laughed softly, surprised, and the strange charge in the room eased into something warmer. Get some rest, even if you don't sleep, she told him. Big day tomorrow. I intend to be entirely presentable, he promised. And though she returned to her room still faintly unsettled, she found to her own surprise that she fell back asleep almost immediately, as though some part of her had already decided, without her permission, that whatever he was not a danger to her. Morning arrived gray and soft, rain sliding down the windows in long, unbroken threads. Elena emerged already dressed, her hair pinned back, nerves visible in the quick, restless way she moved around the kitchen. "You didn't sleep," she said, eyeing the untouched cot. "I don't sleep much. That's not normal." "Very little about me is normal, Elena," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him a beat too long before she turned back to the coffee pot. They drove out of the city together as the rain eased into a fine gray mist, past rows of dripping evergreens and fields turning gold at the edges, toward the vineyard outside the small town of Fernbrook, where her cousin Camille would be married that afternoon. Elena sat rigid in the passenger seat, twisting the fabric of her dress between her fingers. "You're nervous," Adrian observed. "My entire extended family is about to examine you like a used car. I have survived congressional hearings. You have not survived Aunt Priscilla." He considered this with the gravity of a man weighing a genuine threat. Fair point. Before they left the car, he turned to her one last time. "Remember our story, a charity dinner. 2 months, I invest in failing companies. You love grilled cheese. I object to that last fact, too late to renegotiate. And controlled physical contact," Elena added, laughing despite the nerves tightening her voice. "That still sounds like something out of an employee handbook." "It is meant to," Adrian said, and, for a moment, walking beside her toward the sound of distant music and clinking glasses, he felt something dangerously close to anticipation, an emotion he had not experienced in longer than the vineyard itself had existed. Rows of grapevines rolled across the hills of Hollow Creek Vineyard under a sky the color of pewter. Strings of small lights already glowing faintly between the trellises, though evening was still hours away. Elena spotted her aunt almost instantly, a tall woman in lavender scanning the arriving guests with the concentration of someone conducting a security screening. "There," Elena murmured. "That's Priscilla. She looks formidable. I warned you." Aunt Priscilla crossed half the lawn before they had gone 10 steps, her eyes moving over Adrian with open, unhurried appraisal. "So this must be the famous investor," she said, extending her hand. Adrian took it, and if her fingers found his unusually cold, she gave no sign of noticing. "Adrian Ashcombe, I've heard a great deal about you, and I've heard rather less about you, which I intend to correct immediately." Elena slipped her arm through his, and Priscilla noticed everything at once: the tailored coat, the unhurried stillness, the way Adrian turned slightly toward Elena whenever she spoke, as though tracking the sound of her voice against everything else in the noisy afternoon. "Elena tells us you met at some charity dinner," Priscilla said. "A fundraiser," Adrian answered smoothly, "supporting an education program for children who need extra help in school." Elena nearly stopped breathing. He had woven her brother into the lie without a single warning glance. "And you noticed Elena there," Priscilla pressed. "Why?" Adrian glanced sideways at her before answering. Everyone else in that room was working very hard to look important. Elena was on her knees helping a caterer pick up broken glass. It had never happened. It felt, somehow, entirely true. "She seemed real," he said simply, and Priscilla's carefully guarded expression softened by exactly 1 degree. Uncle Desmond arrived next, broad-shouldered and already carrying a drink, clapping Adrian on the shoulder hard enough to test a lesser man's balance. "So you're Elena's mystery man. Investor, huh? You own property around here?" "An apartment in the city. Elena and I have discussed a house eventually." Priscilla brightened visibly. "A house? We're still arguing about furniture," Elena cut in quickly. "She favors beautiful things," Adrian said, entirely straight-faced. "I favor things capable of surviving actual use. That is not what we agreed to argue about," Elena whispered, and it came out so naturally that Desmond roared with laughter. "I like him," he announced to no one in particular. When the ceremony itself began, Elena found herself unexpectedly moved, watching Camille and Frank exchange vows beneath the canopy, while the vineyard's long shadows stretched gold and green across the grass. "Do you, Frank, promise to choose her again? Not just today, but on the difficult days too?" the officiant asked, and Frank's answer, simple and unhesitating, seemed to land on Elena with more weight than she expected. Beside her, Adrian sat very still, watching the ceremony with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between wistfulness and old, careful distance. "You look like you've seen 100 of these," she whispered. "More than that," he admitted quietly, not taking his eyes off the couple. "Do they ever stop meaning something?" she asked, curious despite herself. He considered the question with real seriousness. The honest ones don't, he said. Most people mistake the ceremony for the promise. The ceremony is easy. Keeping the promise on an ordinary Tuesday, years later, when nobody is watching and there are no flowers involved, that is the difficult part, and the part worth witnessing. Elena glanced at him, startled by the quiet conviction in his voice, and found herself wondering, not for the first time that day, exactly how many ordinary Tuesdays a man like Adrian had watched slip past without anyone beside him to share them. When the vows ended and the small crowd rose in applause, Adrian clapped along with everyone else, and Elena noticed, with a small private ache, that his eyes lingered on the newly married couple a moment longer than the applause required, as though he were memorizing something he did not often let himself want. The ceremonies passed peacefully beneath a canopy strung with pale flowers, and at the reception that followed, the questions continued without mercy. Priscilla asked about Adrian's parents. He explained, with practiced ease, that they had lived abroad for as long as he could remember, which was truer than anyone at that table could have guessed. She asked whether he cooked. He admitted gravely that he did not, and Elena added that he compensated by ordering absurdly expensive food instead, a detail that seemed to delight Priscilla more than any polished answer could have. At dinner, Adrian presented the newlyweds with a framed painting by a young local artist rather than an envelope of money. Priscilla examined it with open suspicion. "The important thing," Adrian said, "is that it may become meaningful, an investment in the future rather than the moment." The phrase pleased her enormously, and she repeated it twice more before the night was through. At one point during the reception, Camille pulled Elena aside near the edge of the tent, still glowing in her wedding gown, and studied her with the particular scrutiny only a favorite cousin could get away with. "He watches you like you're the only interesting thing in the room," Camille said, nodding toward Adrian, who stood a short distance away, patiently enduring one of Desmond's longer stories. "It's new," Elena said carefully. "Is it serious?" "I don't know yet," Elena admitted, and realized, with some surprise, that the answer felt more honest than anything else she had said all day. "He's careful with people. Careful in a way I'm not used to." "That's not a bad thing, you know," Camille said, squeezing her hand. "Frank was terrified of me for the first month we dated. Said I asked too many questions." "You do ask too many questions. It worked out fine," Camille said, laughing, and pulled Elena into a quick, flower-scented hug before being swept away by her new husband toward the dance floor. Elena watched her go, then glanced back toward Adrian, who caught her eye across the tent and offered the smallest, most private smile she had seen from him all day, as though the two of them shared some secret the rest of the wedding could not access. She found, standing there in her borrowed dusk-colored dress with music swelling around her, that the fictional relationship she had built out of desperation the day before no longer felt entirely fictional, and the realization unsettled her far more than anything Adrian had said or done since they had met. Later, cornering them near the dance floor, with the precision of a woman who had been waiting all evening for the right moment, Priscilla asked the one question they had not rehearsed. "When are you two getting married?" Elena froze. Adrian did not hesitate. "When Elena is ready," he said. "I have no intention of turning her life into another deadline. We want something lasting, not something rushed because people expect it." His hand closed gently over hers on the table, and Elena looked at him, startled because the answer had not been part of any plan they had built together. For several seconds she forgot entirely that any of it was supposed to be pretending. Priscilla exhaled, satisfied. A man with patience, finally. When she walked away, Elena whispered, "That was good." "I meant it," Adrian said, and before she could ask what exactly he had meant, music swelled through the tent and he offered his hand instead. "I'm terrible at this," she warned. "I've noticed. You dance quite well while clearing tables." Elena stared at him in mock horror. "You've seen that?" "Unfortunately," he said, and she laughed and let him lead her onto the floor, where he guided her through simple, unhurried steps, never once trying to impress the room. Somewhere between the music and the low golden light strung overhead, their carefully rehearsed performance began, dangerously, to feel like something else entirely. The evening deepened, and Adrian survived Desmond's relentless questions about real estate and whether an investor knew the first thing about honest work, even helping move an empty barrel near the service tent without complaint, earning a delighted slap on the back and a permanent place in Desmond's approval. Later, during a crowded turn on the dance floor, Elena's shoe slipped and she stumbled. Adrian caught her before she had fully begun to fall. his hand steadying her waist with a speed that seemed, for one unsettling instant, faster than it should have been. "Careful," he murmured, and the concern in his voice sounded nothing like the polished tone he had used with her relatives all evening. He knelt to slide her shoe back into place, and across the tent, Priscilla watched the entire small scene with eyes gone suspiciously bright. It was in that same moment, as Adrian rose and steadied her properly, that Elena caught a stranger watching them from beyond the string lights, a tall man in dark, old-fashioned clothing who did not so much as blink against the wind, his gaze fixed on Adrian with an intensity that made the hair rise along her arms. When she looked again, he was gone, as though he had simply stepped between one heartbeat and the next, and Adrian's jaw had tightened in a way she had not seen all day. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. "No one who concerns you tonight," Adrian said, and though his voice remained calm, something colder moved behind his pale eyes, gone again before she could be certain she had seen it at all. Near midnight, tradition called the unmarried guests toward the dance floor for the tossing of the bouquet, and Adrian treated it, predictably, like a tactical problem. If catching it creates unwanted attention, stand toward the back. "You cannot calculate a flying bouquet, Adrian. I manage uncertainty professionally. You are impossible." Camille turned her back to the crowd and threw, and the flowers arched directly toward Elena. Adrian moved before she could react, stepping between her and the bouquet and pulling her gently sideways, as though shielding her from something falling from a great height. The flowers sailed past them and landed, to everyone's surprise, in Sophie's startled arms. Across the tent, Priscilla immediately found a new target for her attention, and Elena dissolved into helpless laughter. "Did you just defend me from flowers?" "Successful risk mitigation," Adrian said gravely, and she laughed harder still, until Priscilla shot them both a fond, exasperated look, and the night finally, mercifully, began to wind down. They made their farewells beneath the fairy lights, Priscilla hugging Elena tightly and murmuring, "You did well," words that settled strangely in Elena's chest all the way back to the car, as though choosing the right man were an achievement, rather than a fact of her worth. She remained quiet on the long drive home, watching the dark fields blur past the window until Adrian finally spoke. "Something changed. My aunt thinks my life is successful now. Isn't that what you wanted for tonight?" "I thought so," he admitted. She turned to him. "But yesterday I was the same person. Same job, same brother, same bills. Tonight she looked at me differently only because she believed a wealthy man wanted me." Adrian said nothing for a long moment. "That feels terrible," she added quietly. "Then perhaps," he said finally, "we solved the wrong problem." For all his composure, he seemed genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty, more than anything he had done all evening, made him feel less like a king and more like a man beside her in the dark. Outside her apartment, Adrian turned off the engine, and the silence between them felt heavier than any silence that had come before. "We still have the financial part of our arrangement," he said. "Tomorrow, Adrian, please." He stopped. "I know what we agreed, but I find I don't want this weekend to end with a bank transfer." Elena exhaled slowly. "I also don't believe boredom was the real reason you did this." He looked forward through the windshield for a long moment before he spoke again. "My entire existence is transactional," he admitted. "People bring me their problems because they expect that power can solve anything. When I overheard you, I could have hired someone, introduced you to someone suitable. Instead, I wanted to participate myself. Why? Because you needed someone, not something." Elena felt her throat tighten. "For one weekend," he continued, "I was useful without being merely a source of money. Thank you for being useful," she said softly. "You're welcome." He reached into his coat and handed her a plain card bearing only his name and a private number. "We will need a believable ending eventually." She laughed despite the ache still sitting her chest. "Of course you've already planned our breakup. We cannot leave loose threads. Fine. In a month you become unbearable about house floors. I hate marble." "Perfect," he said. And something in the simplicity of the word made the ending feel, absurdly, like a beginning instead. They met again the following evening at a quiet park overlooking the dark water beyond the city, where Adrian arrived without his usual coat and looked in a plain gray sweater. Almost startlingly young, they spoke of the fake breakup for perhaps 15 minutes before the conversation wandered somewhere else entirely, stretching past 2 full hours beneath the street lamps. Elena described the exhausting rhythm of double shifts and her brother's report cards. Adrian admitted, with visible reluctance, that he collected rare books he rarely opened. "That's incredibly ridiculous," she told him. "Finally, an honest review," he said, and the sound of his own laugh seemed to surprise him. Before they parted, he offered something unexpected. "My company has a problem," he said. "Too much polish, not enough reality." She stared at him. "I'm a waitress, precisely. That is not a qualification most people would offer, and it may be the best one available to me." He proposed weekly meetings, where she would tell him plainly which of his ideas sounded clear, which sounded arrogant, and which had drifted so far from ordinary people that no one would ever trust them. He would pay her fairly for her time. "No pretending," she said. "No pretending," he agreed. "Strictly business." She extended her hand, and he shook it, his grip as cold and steady as it had been the very first day. Their Wednesday meetings, meant to be brief and professional, stretched longer each week, and Elena began arriving at Ashcombe Manor itself rather than his downtown offices, drawn there first by curiosity, and later by something she did not examine too closely. The manor sat above the city on a hill wrapped in old cedar trees, its stone facade older than anything else she had seen in Wintermere, its halls lined with portraits whose brass plaques bore dates that could not possibly be correct. She noticed, slowly, the things that did not fit. No mirrors hung anywhere in the house, not even in the grand entry where a house of that scale would ordinarily display several. The staff moved with a quiet, unnatural grace, never quite meeting her eyes for longer than courtesy required. Adrian never ate in front of her, though he always ordered food when they met in public, and the coffee at his elbow, she noticed once, sat completely untouched from beginning to end. "You never actually drink that," she said one evening, nodding toward his cup. Adrian's expression flickered, caught between amusement and something more careful. "I have unusual habits," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She let it go, though the question lodged itself somewhere she could not quite dislodge, and she began, without meaning to, cataloging every strange detail the way a person collects pieces of a puzzle they are not yet ready to assemble. Their Wednesday evenings developed a rhythm of their own, one that had little to do with the presentations that had supposedly brought them together. Elena would arrive to find Adrian already waiting in the manor's smaller sitting room rather than his formal office, a stack of slides open on the table more out of habit than genuine need. This one, she told him one week, tapping a slide dense with phrases like synergistic value capture and forward-leaning capital deployment, sounds like it was written by a machine that hates people. "Our communications director wrote that himself with considerable pride." "Then your communications director needs to spend a week refilling coffee at the Wren and Thistle." Adrian laughed, an unguarded sound she had come to listen for without quite admitting it to herself, and crossed out the entire paragraph without argument. Between the corrections, they drifted, inevitably, into easier conversation, and Elena learned things about him in fragments rather than announcements, that he read the same handful of novels over and over, rather than seeking new ones, that he kept a garden of night-blooming flowers behind the manor, that he tended personally, that he had once, centuries earlier, funded a hospital under a name no history book now remembered. In turn, he learned that she hummed under her breath while cleaning, that she had wanted, as a child, to become a marine biologist before life rearranged her priorities, that her greatest fear was not poverty itself but the slow erosion of becoming someone who had simply stopped trying. "You haven't stopped trying," Adrian told her once quietly, when she admitted as much. "I notice things, Elena. That is the one skill I have had centuries to perfect." She had looked at him for a long moment after that, aware, with a small private thrill, that whatever this arrangement had started as, it had become something else entirely, something she was no longer certain she wanted a believable ending for. It was on one such evening, as autumn rain lashed the tall windows of the manor's library, that a man arrived unannounced, tall and pale in dark old-fashioned clothing, the same stranger Elena had glimpsed beyond the wedding lights months before. Adrian rose the moment the doors opened, his entire posture shifting into something colder and far more formal than Elena had ever seen from him. "Malaki," he said, and the single word carried the weight of an old and unwelcome debt. "Adrian," the stranger replied, his eyes sliding toward Elena with open, unhurried interest. "How charming. I had heard rumors of a mortal companion, but I confess I did not entirely believe them." "This is not your concern. Everything you do is my concern, Your Majesty," Malachi said, and the title landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elena's breath caught. Adrian did not look at her, but the muscle along his jaw tightened visibly. "The conclave does not forgive kings who forget what they were born to rule," Malachi continued softly. "Especially kings who grow fond of what they were meant only to govern." "Leave," Adrian said, his voice dropping into something low and resonant that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. Malachi smiled, unbothered, and inclined his head toward Elena one last time before turning unhurried toward the door. "We will speak again," he said, "very soon." When he was gone, the room felt colder than it had any right to be, and Elena stood frozen amid the silence, staring at the man she had thought, until that exact moment, she was beginning to understand. "Your Majesty," Elena repeated, backing a step away from him. "What does that mean, Adrian?" For a long moment he said nothing, and in the silence, the library seemed to grow colder, the candles along the far wall guttering, though no window stood open. When he finally looked at her, his eyes had changed, the pale gray deepening at the edges into something closer to garnet, a color she would have sworn, an hour earlier, no human eye could hold. "I am not what you believe me to be," he said quietly. "I gathered that much," she said, though her voice shook. "Say it plainly." "I am the vampire king of this court," he said, "and have been for longer than the city outside these walls has existed." Elena's legs nearly gave beneath her, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "You're joking. I have never once joked about this." She wanted desperately to laugh, to call it an elaborate cruelty, but the memory of his ice-cold hands, his untouched coffee, the mirrorless halls of his ancient house, arranged themselves into a shape she could no longer refuse to see. "Show me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian hesitated, then let the illusion he had worn every day since she had met him fall away entirely. His skin paled further still, luminous and strange in the candlelight, and when he spoke again, the faintest edge of something sharper than human teeth caught the light. Elena did not scream. She stood very still, staring at the truth she had half suspected for weeks, and felt something inside her chest crack open rather than shatter. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Why any of this?" "Because for the first time in longer than I can measure," Adrian said, "someone looked at me and did not want anything I could give them. You wanted to understand who I was. No one has asked that of me in centuries." Elena did not go home that night. She sat instead in a corner booth of an all-night diner 2 streets from the manor, turning a cold cup of tea in slow circles while she called Sophie for the second time in as many months. "I need you to not ask any follow-up questions," Elena said, "and just tell me if I sound insane. I make no promises, but go ahead. If someone told you the person you'd started falling for was something out of an old story, something that shouldn't exist, but he had never once made you feel unsafe, never lied to you about anything that actually mattered, would you stay to find out more, or would you run?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That depends entirely on what kind of something we're talking about, Elena. I can't tell you that part. Then I'm going to assume it's either a cult or something out of a late-night movie, and either way, my answer is the same. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone but yourself. If this is the first thing that's ever made you feel chosen instead of needed, don't throw it away because it's frightening. Just don't throw yourself away for it either." Elena sat with that for a long moment after they hung up, watching the diner's fluorescent lights buzz faintly overhead, and found that Sophie, without knowing a single true detail, had somehow named exactly the fear sitting beneath everything else. She was not afraid, in the end, of what Adrian was. She was afraid of losing herself the way she nearly had at the wedding, of becoming someone's project again, comfortable and small and grateful. It was that fear, more than any lingering doubt about fangs or centuries or courts she could not begin to picture, that she carried back to the manor before dawn, determined to ask Adrian the only question that actually mattered to her. She found Adrian exactly where she had left him, still standing in the library as though he had not moved in all the hours she had been gone, and something in his carefully composed face loosened with visible relief at the sight of her. She should have run the night before. Some ancient, sensible part of her still insisted she should have. Instead, she crossed the room and asked him everything, and he answered without evasion for the first time since they had met, telling her of courts and conclaves, of centuries spent balancing the fragile peace between his kind and the mortal world they moved unseen among, of Malachi Thorne, an elder of the conclave who had never forgiven Adrian for the reforms that he had pushed through decades earlier, reforms that limited the old hungers that bound even kings to restraint. "He wants my throne," Adrian said simply. "He has wanted it for longer than you have been alive, and now he has found the one thing he can use against me." "Me," Elena said. "You." The word hung between them, heavy and undeniable. "Then send me away," she said, though the thought of it hollowed something out inside her. "Protect yourself." "I considered it," Adrian admitted. "I am considering it still, and I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I cannot make myself do it." She crossed the room and took his cold hand in both of hers, and for once he did not flinch away from the contact, or retreat behind careful, practiced distance. "Then we face it together," she said, "or not at all." He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his ancient face. "You understand what that means, what I am. I understand that you have never once, in all these months, made me feel like something you owned." That, more than anything else she could have said, seemed to settle something long unsettled behind his eyes. The blow, when it came, arrived 3 nights later, swift and merciless in the way old grievances always are. Elena had closed the café alone, the streets outside slick with the season's first hard frost, when the air around her turned suddenly unnaturally still. Malachi stepped from the shadow of the alley beside the wren and thistle, as though he had simply always been standing there, waiting. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a request. "I don't think so," Elena managed, though her voice betrayed her fear. "I am not here to harm you, mortal. Not yet. I am here to deliver a message your king has been too sentimental to hear from anyone else." He circled her slowly, unhurried, the streetlight failing to catch any warmth in his pale eyes. "Adrian believes love is a private matter, a quiet indulgence he can keep in the corners of his very long life. He is wrong. A king who is vulnerable is a king who endangers every one of his own kind. You are a door left open, and doors left open eventually let in things far worse than me." "Then close it yourself," Elena said, forcing steel into her voice despite the trembling in her hands. "I intend to," Malachi said softly, and in the space of a breath he had closed the distance between them entirely, his cold fingers closing around her wrist with a grip like iron. "Come quietly, and perhaps your king will finally remember what he was crowned to protect." The last thing Elena saw before the world tilted sideways into darkness was a single black feather drifting down through the frozen air, settling silently on the wet pavement where she had stood only a moment before. Adrian felt it before Milo's frantic phone call ever reached him, a wrongness moving through the bond of the city itself, the kind of disturbance a king who had ruled that ground for centuries could not fail to sense. He arrived at the cafe within minutes, finding only the black feather on the frost-slick pavement and the cooling absence of a life that had, without his permission, become the center of his own. "Where has he taken her?" he said aloud to the empty street, and the city, in its own old and silent way, answered him. He found them at the edge of Fernbrook, in the ruined chapel that had once served as neutral ground between rival courts long before Wintermere had a name. Elena sat bound to an old stone pillar, pale but unbroken, her chin lifted in open defiance despite the fear plainly written across her face. "Let her go, Malachi," Adrian said, stepping through the broken doorway with a stillness more dangerous than any shout could have been. "Ah," Malachi said, unhurried, circling the pillar like a man inspecting a piece of furniture. "There he is, the king who traded 3 centuries of careful restraint for a waitress with kind eyes." "This is between us," Adrian said. "Release her. It became between us the moment you decided a mortal mattered more than the peace you swore to protect." Malachi's fingers drifted toward Elena's throat, unhurried, almost gentle, and Adrian felt something ancient and furious rise in his chest, a power he had spent decades learning to leash. "Careful," Malachi warned softly, watching him. "Strike me here, and you prove every argument I have ever made against you. A king ruled by feeling is a king unfit to rule." "Then I will not strike you," Adrian said, and something in his measured calm seemed to unsettle Malachi more than rage ever could have. "I love her," Adrian said, and the words fell into the cold chapel air with the weight of a vow older than either of them. "Not as weakness, not as a door left open for our enemies. As the first true thing I have wanted for its own sake in longer than you have existed, Malachi. You may call that a failing of kings. I call it the only proof I have left that I am still capable of being one." Elena, bound and shivering, looked at him with something breaking open across her face. "Adrian," she whispered. "I mean it," he said, not looking away from Malachi even once. Every word. Malachi's composure flickered, just slightly, the first real crack Adrian had seen in decades of careful, patient hatred. "Sentiment will not save your throne." "Perhaps not," Adrian said, "but it will save her, and I find, to my own great surprise, that this is the trade I choose." He raised his hand, not in violence, but in summons, and the old stones of the chapel answered a king they had known far longer than they had ever known Malachi Thorne. The candles guttered and roared to sudden life along every ledge. The shadows themselves seemed to lean toward Adrian rather than away, and Malachi, elder as he was, took an involuntary step backward as the full weight of centuries of authority pressed down upon that small, ruined room. "The conclave granted you influence, Malachi," Adrian said quietly. "I hold the crown, There is a considerable difference, and you have chosen tonight, of all nights, to forget it. For a long, taut moment, nothing moved at all. Then Malachi laughed, low and humorless, and released his grip on the shadows he had gathered around himself. You would truly divide the conclave over one mortal woman. I would divide considerably more than that, Adrian said, and there was no doubt left in his voice at all. Malachi studied him a moment longer, weighing consequences Elena could not begin to guess at, before he finally inclined his head, the gesture stiff with old wounded pride. Then let the record show, he said coldly, that the king chose his heart over his crown, and that I warned him precisely what such a choice would cost. He turned without another word and dissolved into the dark beyond the broken chapel doorway, leaving only the smell of cold stone and old smoke behind him. Adrian crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides and knelt to free Elena's bound wrists, his cold hands trembling. She realized with some astonishment, for the very first time since she had known him. You came, she said, her voice cracking. I would have torn down every court that has ever sworn loyalty to me, he said quietly, before I let anything happen to you. She reached up and pressed her palm against his cold cheek, and he leaned into the touch the way a man starved of warmth leans toward a fire he has convinced himself he does not deserve. Say it again, she whispered. I love you, Adrian said plainly, without a trace of the careful distance he had once used like armor. I have loved you since before I understood what the feeling was called. Elena pulled him down and kissed him then, in the ruined chapel, beneath candles that should have long since burned out, and for the first time in 3 centuries, Adrian Ashcombe felt something that was not calculation, not strategy, not the slow, patient weight of rule, but simply, entirely, joy. They walked out of the ruined chapel together into a night gone strangely calm, the frost underfoot no longer feeling quite so threatening now that Elena's hand rested inside Adrian's cold, steady grip. Neither of them spoke for a while, content simply to breathe, to exist in the ordinary miracle of a danger survived. You're shaking, Adrian said eventually, noticing the small tremor she had been trying to hide since the chapel. So are you, she pointed out, and he glanced down at his own hand as though noticing it for the first time in centuries. I suppose I am. He drove her home slowly, the city passing in soft, watercolor smears through the rain-streaked windshield, and when they reached her building, he walked her all the way to her door rather than simply opening the car for her the way he always had before. I meant everything I said in there, he told her quietly, framed in the dim hallway light. I know, Elena said. I could hear it. I would understand, he added, if tonight changed how you see all of this. What I am does not disappear because I said the right words in a burning chapel. Nothing about you has ever been simple, Adrian, she said, reaching up to touch his face again, marveling faintly at how quickly the cold beneath her palm had become familiar rather than frightening. But you have never once made me feel unsafe. Not really. Not even tonight. He turned his head just enough to press a slow kiss to her palm, and the gesture undid her more completely than the declaration in the chapel had. Get some rest, he murmured. I intend to make certain nothing like tonight happens again. That sounds like a promise you can't actually keep. No, he admitted. But I intend to try regardless. And she believed him, entirely, as she closed the door softly behind her, and finally let the last of the night's fear drain slowly out of her shoulders. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them had planned for, and both of them, quietly, treasured. Elena told Priscilla that the arrangement with Adrian had simply run its course, unable to explain the truth, even to herself, let alone to an aunt who still asked pointed questions about marble flooring. Priscilla was disappointed, but for the first time in her life, Elena did not apologize for being uncertain about her own future. I would rather be honest about not knowing, she told her aunt one evening, than pretend for your comfort. Priscilla fell silent, then, unexpectedly, nodded. Maybe I pushed too hard, she admitted, and it was the closest thing to an apology Elena had ever received from her. Meanwhile, the fallout from the chapel spread quietly through the conclave's older bloodlines, and Adrian, though he had won the confrontation, understood better than anyone that a king who defied tradition still owed the courts an accounting. I have to go, he told Elena one gray morning, standing in her small kitchen with the particular stillness he wore when delivering unwelcome news. For how long? At least a year. The northern seat requires my presence to settle what Malachi's challenge stirred loose. If I do not go, the unrest will not stop with him. Elena's stomach tightened, but she did not argue. Then go, she said, and come back. I intend to, he said, and pressed something small and cold into her palm before he left, an old signet ring bearing a black stone, the twin of the one he always wore. So one small thing in your life remains certain, he told her, while I am gone. Life in Wintermere grew quieter after that, though not empty. Elena moved into a slightly larger apartment near the edge of the old district, close enough to walk to the Wren and Thistle on the mornings her shifts began early. Her brother Caleb, steadied by the tutoring Adrian's money had made possible, brought home a report card with marks she pinned proudly to the refrigerator, right beside the schedule that had once hung there crooked and worn. She kept working at the café because she loved its familiar rhythm, though she no longer lived in fear of the next unpaid bill. Milo, ever loyal, began taking evening classes toward becoming a manager himself, and Elena helped him study late accounting problems that, after months spent reviewing Adrian's presentations, no longer looked entirely foreign to her. A new coworker named Ivy joined not long after, watching Elena run the floor during a chaotic Saturday rush and remarking, with open admiration, "You basically run this place already. You should apply for the supervisor position." The old version of Elena would have doubted herself out of the running before she even tried. The new one applied and got it. In the months that followed, Elena visited Ashcombe Manor more often than she admitted even to herself, welcomed each time by staff who had grown quietly fond of her during Adrian's long absence, and by the aging groundskeeper who still tended the night-blooming garden exactly as Adrian had taught him decades before. She sat sometimes in the library where the truth had first been spoken aloud, reading through the handful of novels Adrian returned to again and again, beginning to understand, in small pieces, the particular loneliness of a life stretched across centuries. Letters arrived from the northern seat every few weeks, brief and formal in a way that made her smile rather than worry, since she had learned by then that formality was simply the shape his affection took when distance made anything softer feel too dangerous to risk. "Keep building something that belongs to you," one letter read. "Stay practical. Do not let Milo redesign the cafe's menu again without adult supervision." She saved every one of them in a small wooden box Camille had given her as a wedding favor, and read them again on the nights the manor's quiet felt too large to sit inside alone. Priscilla, for her part, gradually stopped asking when Elena would marry, redirecting her considerable attention instead towards Sophie, who had begun, much to everyone's amusement, dating someone she had met entirely without Priscilla's interference. A development Priscilla regarded with open suspicion, despite having nothing whatsoever to do with it. Caleb grew steadier and more confident with each passing semester, and Elena found, watching him thrive, that she no longer measured her own worth by how well she managed to hold every piece of both their lives together alone. Something in her had loosened, slowly, into the shape of a woman who trusted that help, freely given, did not have to be repaid in performance. Nearly a year to the day after Adrian left for the northern seat, on a mild spring morning with the first real sunlight Wintermere had seen in months slanting gold across the counter, Elena was wiping down the espresso machine when the bell above the door rang. She looked up, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Adrian stood in the doorway without his usual formal coat, his white hair catching the unfamiliar sunlight, his pale eyes settling on her with an expression she had not seen since the ruined chapel. "Good morning, Elena," he said, and his voice carried across the quiet cafe exactly the way it had the very first time he had crossed this same floor. "You're back," she managed. "The conclave is settled. Malachi has withdrawn his claim entirely. And your throne? Stable for now, though I find I care rather less about that than I once did." He rested his cold hands on the counter, the same counter where their impossible arrangement had first begun. "I spent a year among perfectly ordered courts, perfectly predictable rituals, and centuries-old certainty," he said. It was unbearable. Elena tried and failed not to smile. "I missed being told my ideas were terrible," he continued. "I missed someone who cared more about her brother's mathematics scores than the balance of ancient courts." He glanced toward her hand, where the black-stoned ring still sat, worn every single day of the year he had been gone. "I see the one certain thing held," he said quietly. "It did," she said. "What happens now?" He gestured toward his old corner table, unchanged, waiting exactly as it always had. "I order coffee. You finish your shift, and afterward we sit together as two people who no longer need a story prepared in advance." "That sounds dangerously unplanned," she said, echoing words she barely remembered speaking a year before. "I am trying something new," Adrian said, and this time, when she poured his coffee, he lifted the cup and, for the first time since she had known him, actually drank from it, watching her over the rim with eyes that had finally stopped measuring the distance between them. Priscilla learned of Adrian's return within days, and true to form, Her first phone call to Elena began exactly as predicted. "So you two are back together then?" "We're spending time together," Elena said carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said, Aunt Priscilla." There was a long pause, the particular silence of a woman recalibrating decades of habit. "All right," Priscilla said finally. "I suppose I'm learning." It was such a small sentence, and it meant, Elena thought, considerably more than her aunt likely realized. Weeks later, Adrian invited Priscilla and Desmond to the manor for dinner, a gesture Elena had not expected, and privately worried about for days beforehand, certain that some detail, some untouched glass or missing mirror, would finally give the truth away. Instead, Priscilla spent the entire evening thoroughly charmed by the night garden and mildly suspicious of the complete absence of family photographs, a suspicion Adrian deflected with such smooth, practiced ease that Elena nearly laughed into her napkin. "He's odd," Priscilla admitted afterward, in the careful tone she reserved for her highest compliments, "but he looks at you like you're the only sensible thing in his very complicated life." "I'll take odd if it comes with that." Elena thought of Malachi's cold voice in the ruined chapel, of everything Adrian had risked and nearly lost to keep exactly this ordinary, unremarkable evening possible, and found she could not disagree. Somewhere above the café, unnoticed by either of them, a single raven settled briefly on the wet rooftop and then took flight again, vanishing into a sky that had at last begun to clear. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from being seen exactly as you are, and finding that the person looking at you stays anyway, and I think, if this story leaves you with anything at all, it should be that. Elena did not need a king to rescue her from an uncomfortable wedding, and Adrian, for all his centuries and all his careful power, did not need a mortal woman to prove he was still capable of feeling something real. What they actually needed, both of them, was permission to stop performing the version of themselves that other people found easiest to approve of. It is a strange thing how much of adult life gets spent building a self that photographs well for other people's expectations. An aunt's approval, a court's tradition, a family's quiet worry about whether we have arranged our lives correctly. I have watched people build entire decades around that kind of performance, and I have done a fair share of it myself, smiling through gatherings while some smaller, truer part of me stayed folded up and unseen. What I have come to believe, slowly and sometimes painfully, is that love worth keeping rarely announces itself with certainty. It shows up first as attention, someone noticing the ordinary, unglamorous details of your life and treating them as worth remembering rather than worth fixing. It shows up as patience, the willingness to let a person arrive at trust in their own time rather than demanding it on schedule. And it shows up, eventually, as the courage to tell the truth even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it costs something real. Because a love built on careful performance can survive appearances, but rarely survives a crisis. Security matters. Money and stability open real doors, and I would never tell you otherwise. Especially if you have ever lain awake doing the quiet arithmetic of rent against a paycheck that never quite stretches far enough. But security alone does not make a life feel like your own. That comes from being known fully, without needing to perform, and choosing, again and again, to stay anyway. If you take one thing from Elena and Adrian's strange beginning, let it be this. You are allowed to stop auditioning for the approval of people who were never going to see the truest parts of you in the first place. The right ones will not need convincing. They will simply notice, the way Adrian noticed a waitress helping a stranger pick up broken glass, and they will stay, not because the story was perfect, but because you were real.